Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I just watched a podcast on Joe Rogan. This isn't really going to be current events because this thing is a couple years old. I'll try to remember to link this one down below. But it was Dr. Andy Galpin was on Joe Rogan, and just in the first hour of this podcast, it really hit a lot of things that I like to think about. And the guy actually, being a legitimate expert, he is a researcher who works mostly with muscle fibers, studying actual muscle fibers and physiology. He's an exercise physiologist who studies muscle fibers under a microscope for a living, but he also, as a side hobby, advises and coaches MMA athletes and everything with their strength and conditioning, and actually works with some world level athletes as a side hobby. Interesting guy. But he had a lot to say regarding things like cardio, mixing cardio with your resistance training. Inflammation. They were talking about recovery and inflammation and everything else, and even saying that sometimes there's not even a right and a wrong answer. That when you're coaching people, a lot of things are so context specific that you have to understand them from that context. And I thought that was fascinating because it really touches upon a lot of things I've been talking about lately. Because for me, as a master strength athlete, I'm always trying to balance my strength with things like fitness, cardiovascular capacity, things like that, because being in shape helps us even as lifters, right? Even if your only goal is to compete in powerlifting or Olympic lifting or some maximum strength or maximum power sport that doesn't even have an endurance component, we know that your fitness matters. We know that your conditioning matters. It affects your work capacity. It affects your recovery. You have to do conditioning work. You need to be in shape. You need to be in shape. It will impact you. And obviously, it'll affect your longevity and quality of life and everything else. But what we're always seeking is, can we find ways to allow us to lift more heavy weight more often with more volume? Right? We're always looking at how can we improve our work capacity, because the more quality training you can get, the stronger you can get. Right? And so things like controlling inflammation and even balancing your cardio with all of it is absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical, particularly as we get older, right? Those of us who are middle-aged and up, we have to balance these things, and it's important. We have to be finding ways that we can train more, recover more effectively, and that includes conditioning work. What I thought was interesting, though, is that he brought up the point of, you don't want to do your cardio immediately after strength training. And again, this is something I try to stress to people, because I've had people ask me that recently. That's one reason I wanted to bring that up. I've had people ask me that recently. Like one of the guys on my Facebook fan page, he's currently infantry in the Army. And he's like, hey, I have to run 3 times a week. How should I space this out around my training? And it's always, you separate it out, because I do cardio every single day. I do low intensity cardio every day. I do some high intensity cardio. But I do at least list cardio 7 days a week, right? Minimum 30 minutes, sometimes up to 2 hours right now. But that's a little rare, only maybe once a week will I do 2 hours in a day. But I do it every day, but I also do serious strength training 4 days a week. I do concurrent periodization with 2 max effort days, 2 dynamic effort days, and then I do resistance training, active recovery and stuff on all my off days. So for me, I space them out. And, Joe had asked him the question of what's optimal, and he said, we don't actually know what's optimal. We don't have enough research. He's like, but ideally, he goes, I'd like to see you space them out as far as possible. If you're going to do them in the same day, 4 or 6 hours apart. And Joe had said, well, I'd always heard at least 2. And he's like, well, 2's a good start. But if you're trying to maximize, if you're trying to optimize everything, and we don't know what optimal is, he goes, but I would lean in the direction of saying it's going to be as far apart as you can get away with. What's going to fit into your lifestyle, into your schedule. And that's interesting, because for me, I shoot for usually at least 3 to 4. Usually at least 3 to 4. And like if I do a max effort squat session, I try to space it out quite a bit. So if I finish my squats, 9 a.m., and I might do my other accessory work all the way up through 10 or whatever, I probably am not going to do any of my cardio till at least 2 or 3 o'clock. And I'm only going to do maybe 30 minutes on a max effort day. I'm going to limit it. So I'm going to do it at least 3 or 4 hours, and I'm going to have at least 1,000 calories in between. And again, mainly just to give my body extra fuel to do it on. And people say, well, you're not losing fat doing that. It's like, well, that's not the point. Conditioning work's not always about fat loss. Conditioning work's about being in shape. It's about improving recovery work capacity. But the thing that he pointed out is that you can interfere. That if you do that too soon afterwards, you are going to interfere with the signal. You're going to interfere with things like muscle fiber types and all of that, because that's something that his research has done a lot of research in. That's kind of his area, is that the sort of activities we do affect muscle quality. They do affect muscle fiber distribution, even though it's largely genetic. There's an enormous genetic component. The way that we train over time does affect distribution of things. And he actually had noted even stuff with twin studies looking at that in the interview, which I thought was fascinating. But he pointed that out, that you do need to separate them out. It is important that you separate them out, especially if you're going to be an athlete who trains in multiple disciplines. But shouldn't that be all of us, right? Isn't that what I tell you guys? Even those of us who your goal is maximum strength, you still need conditioning work. You still need to be in shape. You need to be physically fit. And in shape meaning, I'm talking about what we call in shape from a conditioning perspective in the sports world, not the goofy-ass bodybuilding world. People, and remember, this is not a bodybuilding channel. We don't care about competitive bodybuilding. It's a complete garbage lifestyle that everyone should disdain and mock. Should be absolutely mocked completely out of the fitness world. Has no place here. But we need to be fit. And fit includes things like having a good VO2 max, having a cardiovascular capacity, having endurance, having work capacity. That affects your recovery. It will affect how much training volume you can handle, how much you can do in a workout. It will affect things like even rest times for workload density. It will affect recovery. So it does matter. You need to be in shape. The other thing I thought was interesting, they were talking about post-workout recovery stuff, and you said, look, things like cryogenic treatment or ice baths or whatever, you wouldn't want to do that immediately post-workout, because the inflammation response from training is one of the largest drivers of adaptation. In other words, we do spend a lot of time talking about inflammation. And for me, I point out that I do a ketogenic style diet right now because it does help control inflammation. And that is a growing body of scientific literature showing that, right? And anyone who's arguing against that is not up to speed on research. They don't even know what it's being used for medically if they don't know that. It's well understood. So we have situations like that where we do those diets. And, I even saw on another podcast with Joe a while back with an expert in exercise science who does promote those diets of, they were in that discussion of, is it enough to blunt training affect the anti-inflammatory response? And I think even Lane Norton was in that one, and he had said, no, it probably wouldn't. But we kind of come back to that point of, is stuff like that going to control inflammation enough that it might allow you to do a little more training volume and still recover from it? And, that was the interesting thing that he pointed out that was so nuanced. He had said, look, you don't want to do things immediately post-workout to blunt the inflammatory response, because we need that response to happen, right? Elevated cortisol is the hormone most associated with muscle growth during a workout, right? We had meta-analysis come out on that a couple years ago, like 3 years ago. That it turned out the amount of testosterone or growth hormone that you produce as a result of training was not correlated. The amount that you released was not correlated with muscle growth. It wasn't. But the amount of cortisol you produced was. So in other words, workouts that produced more cortisol tended to result in higher muscle growth. It's part of the response. In other words, you create a catabolic response in the muscle tissue. So when you talk about tearing down muscle fibers, you're not talking about physically tearing them. You're not talking about ripping them. You're talking about chemically. You're talking about breaking them down chemically to a catabolic response. Your body is trying to consume your muscle fiber as a fuel source at the local level. Then it starts breaking down those tissue proteins, and your body responds to that chemical cleaving by pushing back in the other direction, trying to reach homeostasis. So you do need that large catabolic response, which is inflammatory in nature, right? You need that localized inflammation to help stimulate the growth process. And so if you blunt it too soon with something like that's going to reduce circulation and everything else, like cryotherapy, cold therapy, soaking in an ice bath, it could blunt the response. You may gain less muscle as a result of it. Same thing. We've noted studies that show that if you take vitamin C post-training, that it can reduce training response, right? Taking large doses of antioxidants immediately after you train can reduce training response. But he had pointed out, he goes, but even then I could say that, but even that's really a nuanced topic. It's so context dependent. He goes, because what happens if I have An athlete, let's say, and he used a bodybuilder as an example. I believe in that one. Says, let's say I have some bodybuilder preparing for a show and they're having so much inflammation from their training that this helps them feel better and train harder so they can burn through more energy, burn through more calories, and peak better for their event. Even though it might blunt their ability to grow muscle as a result, it might improve their overall training volume and their sense of well-being and allow them to continue to train more, which could be psychological in nature. That might lower their overall stress levels. It might improve their confidence, and it might allow them to maybe even burn through more energy, more calories or whatever, for more training, for more fat loss. Even if it does, to some extent, blunt the muscle growth response. So, it was a fascinating talk to me because it kind of showed that things are so nuanced. And when you're dealing with coaching individuals, there's a lot of things that we know, hey, this is true 90% of the time. This is true. Most people have such an overlap of what they need to do. And then you have the things that really are context dependent for the individual. And it's not even a case of, hey, what's right for you. It's a case of what's right for you in this moment in time. Because what's right for you right now may not be right for you in 3 months anymore. That all of that is so context dependent. And that's one of the arts behind coaching. So overall, I thought it was a good talk. I thought it was interesting that he hit upon those different points, discussing things like inflammation post-workout, particularly things like mixing your cardio with your strength training work. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.